Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into some fascinating source material today. Specifically, excerpts from a briefing reported by Banglavision NWS. It's from a YouTube transcript.
Right.
And it covers a really significant recent meeting between the chief advisor and Mr. Tarique Rahman from the BMP.
That's right. And our mission really is to pull out the most important details, the reported insights from this specific source.
Yeah, focus is key here.
Exactly. We're not looking at, broader context beyond what this specific briefing provides, just focusing purely on what this report tells us about the discussion.
Things like election timing, reforms.
Yeah, proposed reforms, other political points that were apparently raised in that specific setting.
Think of it as getting a laser focus for you, the listener, on this one reported account of the meeting. What does this source say happened and was discussed?
Let's get right into it.
Okay, so the source starts by identifying the key players, setting the scene for the meeting itself.
It does. The report confirms the meeting between Mr. Tarique Rahman and the chief advisor.
And it mentions the structure.
Yeah.
Delegation, then one-on-one.
Yeah, what's interesting is how the source presents it. It mentions delegation talks first, and then followed by a one-to-one discussion between the two main figures.
Right, and the overall description of the meeting, according to this report.
The briefing explicitly calls it a fruitful meeting. That's the reported framing.
Fruitful. Okay. Now, moving on to maybe the biggest point of interest, election timing. The source details proposals and positions here. What did Mr. Tarique Rahman propose, according to this briefing?
The report states Mr. Tarique Rahman's proposal was pretty specific. Hold the election before next year's Ramadan.
Okay, before Ramadan. And the source adds that this view aligns with the party chairperson, Begum Khalida Zia.
Yes, it does note that. It says she also believes that time would be good for the election. So that's the position presented from the BNP side, as reported in this briefing.
Right. So that's one side. Now let's look at the chief advisor's position as stated in that meeting, according to this same source.
Well, the source reports the chief advisor reiterated what he'd apparently already announced, that the election will be held by the first half of April next year, 2026.
Okay, April 2026. But there's a really significant detail in the source about a potential earlier date, isn't there? Linked to certain conditions.
Absolutely. This is a key nugget from this source. It quotes the chief advisor, indicating the election could potentially be held earlier.
When exactly?
In the week before the start of Ramadan in 2026. So that is earlier than the first half of April timeline.
And the source is very specific about what needs to happen for that earlier timeline. It's not guaranteed.
No, not at all. The conditionality is explicit in the report. If, and it's a big if, all preparations are completed and, importantly, sufficient progress is achieved.
Sufficient progress on what?
On both reforms and judicial matters. Both need to show that progress by that time.
Okay, so the source clearly links the possibility of that earlier election date to tangible progress in these two specific areas, reforms and judicial matters. That's crucial.
Very crucial linkage reported there.
How did Mr. Tarique Rahman respond to this conditional possibility, according to the briefing?
The source states Mr. Tarique Rahman welcomed this position, actually thanked the chief advisor on behalf of his party.
And the chief advisor reciprocated.
Yes, reportedly thanked Mr. Tarique Rahman in turn for the, quote, fruitful discussion.
Now, this whole discussion on election timing, the source says it was also mentioned in a joint statement afterwards.
It does. The source confirms a joint statement was issued, and yeah, it touches on the election discussion.
And what does the source say about, setting a date?
According to the briefing, the expectation is that the Election Commission will announce a date soon, and the source itself, or rather the People briefing, saw no issues in determining a specific date.
Interesting. What's also really interesting in the source is how it brings up the topic of reforms and consensus. It even introduces this term, the July Charter. What does the briefing report about that?
Yeah, the July Charter. It mentions discussions around something called I-chains that are already taking place nationally.
Okay.
But the source strongly emphasizes how decisions on these reforms and the July Charter will be made.
Oh.
Based on consensus. The report uses the specific term Kayakon. That phrase, based on consensus, is reported as being absolutely central to the decision-making process here.
So consensus is the key principle reported for these reforms. Is there a timeline mentioned for reaching this consensus? Does the source say?
The source indicates this decision, the one based on consensus, is expected to be reached quickly. That's the phrasing used.
Quickly. And once that consensus is achieved, what happens next, according to the report?
Pretty straightforward according to the source. What is decided based on that consensus will then be signed.
Does the source frame reform as, a one-and-done deal? Or is it presented differently?
That's another key insight from this source. It explicitly describes reform as an ongoing process.
Ongoing.
Meaning it's not something that finishes entirely at one specific point. The source clarifies that some reforms where consensus exists will happen before the election.
Right.
But reforms will also continue after the election. It's not all front-loaded.
And the need for this ongoing process, this continuous reform, the source says everyone involved feels it's necessary.
Yes, the source links it directly to the shared pursuit of building what it calls a new Bangladesh. That's presented as the underlying motivation for this approach.
Okay. The briefing, as reported in the source, also touched on a few specific questions that came up. One was about Mr. Tarique Rahman's long stay abroad, especially with that reported statement from the Home Advisor saying there's no obstacle to his return. Did the meeting specifically discuss when he might return, according to this source?
According to the source, no. The discussion on when he might return was apparently deemed unnecessary in the context of this meeting.
So what was the conclusion?
The report essentially states it's a decision for Mr. Tarique Rahman himself to make, in due course. The focus in the meeting, as reported here, just wasn't on the timing of his return.
Got it. Another specific point raised in the briefing, according to this source, involved a judicial process concerning Sheikh Hasina.
Right.
The question reported was whether this process would be completed before the election and what impact it might have. How did the source present the response?
Well, the source actually points the answer back towards the joint statement.
How so?
It links it back to that same condition we discussed. The need for sufficient progress on both reform and judicial matters.
So that judicial process falls under the umbrella of judicial matters needing progress.
Exactly. The hosts mentioned in the briefing apparently expressed confidence that this necessary progress can be seen and completed before the election. So it's reported within that broader category.
Okay. What about other political parties? Was there a question reported about, say, the NCP maybe not participating without reforms first? Did that come up?
Yes, that question was reportedly asked in the briefing.
And the answer?
The response, according to the source, was quite specific. There was no opportunity for discussion on that particular point in the context of this specific meeting.
I see. So not discussed between the chief advisor and Tarique Rahman in that session.
Apparently not. The report notes that while the overall intent is to include everyone in the election, each party ultimately has its own opinion and position.
Right. Let's circle back quickly to the election timing and that joint statement. A question was reportedly asked in the briefing. Something like, did the joint statement suggest the government might move away from that initial April timeframe?
Yeah. How did the source clarify that?
Well, the source is actually quite clear here, it seems. It states the joint statement reinforces the idea.
Reinforces what exactly?
That if all tasks are completed on time and there is that sufficient progress on judicial matters and reforms we keep mentioning, then the election can indeed be held earlier, specifically the week before Ramadan.
Okay. So rather than suggesting a move away from the time frame, the source uses the joint statement to confirm the conditional possibility of an earlier date, but still within that overall stated framework.
Exactly. It confirms the conditionality. Finally, the overall tone, satisfaction with the meeting. How does the source describe how the participants felt?
The report is pretty explicit. It says they were asked directly if they were satisfied, and they confirmed they were surely satisfied. The source uses the term
surely satisfied. And the reason given for this satisfaction, according to the source.
The stated reason reported is the shared goal of working together for building a new Bangladesh.
And that cooperation extends beyond the election.
Yes, the report notes this is meant to continue not just before, but also after the election. That's the reported sentiment.
Does the source offer any, proof of this reported satisfaction?
It does, in a way. The briefing mentions that a joint statement simply wouldn't have been issued if they weren't satisfied.
Okay, that makes sense. That's presented as evidence. And where does the source say this whole process stands right now? The current status?
The word used is ongoing.
Ongoing, okay. So for you, the listener, what we've done here, by sticking strictly to this one source, the Banglavision New WS briefing transcript, is pull out the reported details.
Just what this report contains.
We've seen the specific proposal for election timing, how it's explicitly tied, reportedly, to sufficient progress on reforms and judicial matters.
That linkage is key in this report.
The reported emphasis on consensus for political changes like this July charter and the context around specific questions that were raised, like Tarique Rahman's return and the judicial matter concerning Sheikh Hasina.
And focusing only on this source helps you understand the specific points and the reported nuances, as presented in this particular account, without bringing in outside info.
Right. It gives you a very clear picture of what this briefing reportedly said about that meeting.
Exactly.
And thinking purely about what this source tells us, here's something for you to mull over. The report emphasizes that the possibility of an earlier election date, according to the chief advisor's reported position, depends on sufficient progress in both reforms and judicial matters.
That dual condition.
So as presented in this source, what does that reported explicit pairing, that conditionality, suggest about how these two areas might be intertwined in the path forward, according to this specific briefing?
An interesting point to consider based solely on this account.